Get started. It must be close to 9:30 now, and I promise, well, I don't keep my promises, but I'm going to attempt to get this over with in an hour, because I'm sure we all have better things to do than listen to me. So we're here today, and I want to say again, as I said last week, anything that I say is my own opinion. It's not the opinion of the Easton Historical Society or the Easton Historical Commission, who has absolutely nothing to do with this tour. They've done a wonderful job on a number of things, and we'll be talking about that. We'll also be talking about our barn here, which remains a problem. But let's start with the beginning of Bay Road. Bay Road is a Native American trail that has been used for many thousands of years. It connected the Blue Hills, which was a source of, Jesus, guys, I showered. Would you come on so I don't have to yell? Come on. Thank you. I don't like to use my teacher voice anymore, if I can avoid that. It connected the Blue Hills, which was a source of stone tool material, as was some places here in Northeastern, with the Taunton Weirs. So you might have heard of the Weirs down in Taunton, and that's not an American name. The name Weirs is English, but it was where the Native Americans had fish traps. This was very well traveled. The first European settlers that came through here, like Elizabeth Poole, who led the group that settled Taunton, Massachusetts, found that this trail had been worn down 2 or 3 feet below the surrounding ground just by Native Americans walking over that for years and years and years. And according to many stories, Native Americans created piles of stones in places where something significant happened. If they saw a wild animal of particular interest, or believed that there was a strong spiritual sense, they would make a pile of stones along the road, which is kind of interesting because the colonial settlers have the mileage markers that Bay Road is famous for. The belief that those piles of stones were really signs that said, if you don't like it here, you can go back to where you came from, is not true. Okay, that came later. Actually, it's Oliver Ames that said that to some Irish guys. I was just reading about that before we got here. What happened was that for the longest time, Bay Road was the big connection between Boston, Taunton, and down into Rhode Island. So this was sort of the Route 24 of its time. And a number of taverns sprang up along the road. Okay. I'm committed to getting you out of here in an hour. Otherwise, we would slog all the way up the street in that direction and then slog all the way down the street in the other direction. But let's use your imagination. The oldest house in Easton is that-a-way, and it is school bus yellow. It's a little bit darker than school bus yellow, but you'll recognize it. And it's the oldest house in Easton. It was built in 1717. It's not the oldest building on the property, because the story is that the corn crib there was built in 1713 and is the oldest corn crib in America. Okay. Mainly because most of the other ones just fell down and nobody really cared about them, but this one managed to survive. And that belongs to Josiah Keith, who was not the first settler in Easton, but he came over here in the summertime from West Bridgewater in back of the Sunnyside restaurant and grazed his cattle here. And then would go back home in the wintertime, and then finally made the decision when he had made enough money as a young man and built this house over here, and the family transferred over. So most of the settlers along this part of Bay Road were either Keiths or Williamses. And the next house that I'm going to reference, you can just about see if you step to the edge of the road and look up there, there's a sign. There's an antique store, and that is supposedly the second or third oldest still standing house in town, and that was built about 1735. It's been a real pain in the neck to research the history of that. For years and years and years, Duncan Oliver and I, who did the initial research, thought that the house belonged to Benjamin Williams. And it did, sort of, but it's not really the Benjamin Williams house. It was actually built by his brother John, who lived there until 1756. His brother Benjamin built a house somewhere in the neighborhood of where the parking lot for the community garden and Wheaton farm is located. And eventually that got torn down. And we finally figured it out because the mileage marker in front of this house doesn't have the correct mileage based on the other mileage markers. So it originally stood in front of another house and moved. What does this all mean? Well, what it means is that the original tavern was run by John Williams. And don't quote me on that one. It might have been started by Benjamin, who knows? John, let's say John. John died in 1756. Interestingly enough, he's buried around the corner. We'll see the graveyard, if not the grave, shortly. He died in October of 1756, and between September and November of that year, he died. His 4 sons died, and a daughter died, probably of smallpox, which was ironic because vaccination for smallpox had been inoculation for smallpox had been invented about 40 years before in Boston. But the problem with that, it wasn't vaccination. If you know your Latin, you know that vaxa, or vacus, is cow. And this guy Jenner over in England discovered that milkmaids never came down with smallpox because they all got cowpox instead, which was like chicken pox or whatever. So if you got scratched with the juice from a cowpox you would have immunity to smallpox. But before that, they discovered the same thing. If you scratched a smallpox pox and then scratched yourself, you would get a very mild case of smallpox, and you would be immune to the disease afterwards. Unfortunately, you were also contagious with the real deal for a certain number of days afterwards. So people at that time had a real good reason to be anti-vaxxers. And there's all these stories about towns who wanted to prevent smallpox, creating what they called the smallpox hospital, which was basically a big barn where anybody who had the inoculation would have to stay until they went back, they passed the days. The sad part about it was that they didn't realize that oftentimes their clothes were still contagious, and so they could still spread the disease. So it was very controversial. At any rate, the family was pretty much wiped out, and then that's when Benjamin was able to move into the house. And the mileage marker that's there was originally over there, was moved down here, and it has BW as the thing. Certain number of miles to Taunton and BW. The problem there is that the mileage marker itself is a fake. One of the benefits of education in Easton is one of my students ran the thing over one snowy day, and he came back and said, I learned something in local history class, those mileage markers. I just hit one and it's shattered to smithereens. So the Historical Commission used its funds for that year to buy a fake stone, which nowadays looks pretty old. But that's the fake one. The other ones you'll see along Bay Road are still all original. Okay. One of the interesting things about Bay Road and its taverns is that if you were a really cool tavern, you'd want to have a status symbol. And it was really difficult to park Lexuses out in front of the taverns in those days. So what they did instead was buy slaves. A slave was a status symbol. And down the street, at the entrance of one of the entrances of Wheaton Farm, the place where the Galloway Farm used to be. For those of you who don't know the Galloway Farm, it's where those big silos used to be. And if you don't know that, there's like a little corn crib that sits on Bay Road, and in back of it there's this really big empty space of fields. That was the Matthew Hayward Tavern, which stood for a number of years. It finally partially burned and was removed, and there's a new house there. But the mileage marker is still there in a big pile of poison ivy. Matthew Hayward had a slave, Anthony, which he inherited from his father, who lived over where we're going to visit next week, the Haywood Pool neighborhood. That house where Anthony started is still there. Anthony, or Antone, took the deal. When the Revolutionary War came along, the deal was if you were a slave who were willing to serve in the Revolutionary Army, your master would give you your freedom. So Matthew Hayward, who was our town clerk and very, very involved in the war effort, gave the deal to Anthony. He served briefly at the Siege of Boston and then came back and lived in Easton. Now the problem with this is I'm going to be talking about African American history a lot today, because this seemed to have been an area where our African American population was concentrated, was that if you start life without a last name, it gets hard to track you down. Because Anthony was known as Anthony Hayward. We think he became Anthony Green after he was freed, and this happened in a number of other instances for people in this area, and we'll talk about them when we get to the cemetery. So this was a very prosperous part of town. Rumors were that George Washington actually came here. We believe for a long time that he came to the Benjamin Williams Tavern down the street and stayed there while he was negotiating with the people at our cannon foundry down in Furnace Village. Sadly, none of that's true. Okay. There was another possibility that George Washington spent time at a tavern down at the corner of Bay Road and Summer Street. That's also not true. The problem with being George Washington is there's lots of records that say George was here this day, and none of those have Easton in the name. So we can track the days he was supposed to be here, and the closest he ever got was probably Rentham. He chose an alternate route rather than to come down Bay Road. And that's ultimately what did Bay Road in. Because of Easton's fabulously swampy land, the road tended to disappear on a regular basis, and so the town was often fined for not keeping it up. Stagecoaches traveled this regularly, and it must have been horrific, bouncing up and down. Sort of the same experience you can get today by driving down 138. Okay. But up until about 1800, things were still pretty good. And that led a young man from Norton to move over here and build this beautiful house. And if you come over here, you can get a better look at it. So this is a very special house. There are not a lot of federal-style houses in Easton because the early part of the 1800s was not a boom time for the town. We were waiting for the Ames Shovel Works to get going and provide jobs for a lot of people. So federal-style houses are rare. There's this house, and there's a matching house down in Furnace Village. It's the old Bullfinch Belcher house on the corner of Pequannock. And the story goes that that house was already built by the Leach family at that time, who were iron workers, iron founders, and that the gentleman that moved here said, I want that house, except I want it bigger by 3 feet on each side. And so this is a little bit bigger. The story on this house was interesting too, because that story of, okay, that house was first and this house is second, but this house was built here and blah, blah, blah. So it took us a while to figure it out. Here's the story. Daniel Wheaton was the brother of the man who eventually donated the money to found Wheaton College. So it was a very prominent Norton family. He went to Harvard, and instead of becoming a minister, he became a lawyer. You know, you're working for either one side of the street or you work for the other side of the street. And he became a lawyer and moved to Easton shortly after he was married in 1797. Where did he live? Well, we thought immediately he built this house, but the one down in Furnace Village wasn't built until 1800, and we're pretty sure of that one. So how did this all work out? Well, the answer was he spent time in either the Benjamin Williams house down the street or the real Benjamin Williams house that's not there anymore. And then sometime after 1800, he built this house. Now, why did it take him a few years? Because he had to establish his practice just like every other lawyer. And it's interestingly enough, he began his career, which ended as, you know, one of the very proper lawyers in town, but he began his career by defending his neighbors. His neighbors were part of the biggest criminal conspiracy in New England at the time. They worked for a man named George White, who was one of the most famous horse thieves in all of New England. And the idea of the ring was they would steal horses and ship them up through Vermont into Canada. So they stole a lot of horses. They also broke into stores, and a lot of Wheaton's neighbors were charged with selling stolen goods. So he defended them, and that's how he got the start of his career. He wasn't incredibly successful with those defenses because most of the guys were caught red-handed, but he tried. Later, however, he became a really, really solid citizen, and by 1801, only a few years after, actually right around the same time, he got involved in an even bigger scandal. Okay, I know you all love Hamilton because they got great songs, but the Federalists were losing power. You know, Hamilton was with Washington, and then Adams came in, and nobody liked John Adams. He was not a great guy. As far as, you know, human relations going, halfway decent thing. Other than a war with France, you know, everything was hunky-dory. But it was sad times for the Federalists. So when Adams got voted out in favor of Thomas Jefferson, what he decided to do before he left was stack the government with Federalists. So one of the big appointments you could get in those olden days was postmaster. And Mr. Wheaton got the Federalist appointment to be the postmaster for Easton. And basically what would happen is the stagecoach would roll up here a couple of times a week, drop off the mail, and then he'd take it to church and hand it out on Sundays because everybody went to church. Ultimately, that didn't work because the church split between the Unitarians and the Congregationalists, and Mr. Wheaton was involved in some of that argument as well. But that's how it worked. He became incredibly successful. The farm had 356 acres, and the only person whose tax valuation was higher was Oliver Ames' company. He was technically richer than Oliver Ames as an individual. The house is in the Federal style. You can tell by the wonderful transom window over the door, which is probably the fanciest in town. It's perfectly symmetrical. Unlike the Federalist house that's up on Route 138, or Alice McCarthy's old house up on the corner of Short Street and Center Street, it's a fat house. Federalist houses, if you go up to Salem, which has the epitome of this particular style, the houses are generally one room wide, and then there's like an addition added on the back, like Alice's house. This one is more square. It was built in the style of the older Georgian style with the gewgaws of the Federal style. Wheaton lived a long time. He died in 1841, and he had 3 wives. Unlike most people, however, his 3 wives were all related to each other. His first wife, to whom he was married for the longest time, died, and then within 2 years he married her sister. And then when she died, he married a cousin. So all the women in the family were related. If you're familiar with your Chinese, you know that the symbol for discord in China is more than one woman under the roof of a house. That may be true today, because one of Easton's more well-established ghost stories is the Lady in White. And the real story of the Lady in White, although you can't really ever get the story out of Hazel, but apparently back when she was in high school, one of the people that lived in the house wrote a story, a ghost story, and it was an assignment, and people picked up on it, and it came to be believed that this house was haunted. And then what happened was, sometime in the 1970s, a Boston Globe reporter was driving down the road one foggy night when he reported a woman in white crossing from the barn here and going down the driveway on this side of the house and disappearing into the barn. Okay. So the Lady in White is one of our established ghost stories. If you believe the original story, when you drive by, look at the window on the 2nd floor, because she's alleged to appear there occasionally. And according to one of the people that lived there, the Dre family moved in at the end, there was one of the kids came home and heard somebody whistling Yankee Doodle in the house. And she knew that she was the first one of the 4 or 5 kids in the family to arrive. So she went looking to see who had skipped school. And the whistling kept moving from room to room to room to room. And finally they got to the 2nd floor in the back, and there's no way you can get past anybody up there. There's a dead end on the 2nd floor. And the whistling stopped. She went back downstairs only to discover that she was the only person in the house, and that's another part of the ghost story, so you can believe it or not. The house was built around 1800. The barn, we believe, is a little bit more recent, and unfortunately this wonderful house, well maintained, is in private hands. This barn, not so well maintained, is owned by the fabulous town of Easton, which does so well with its property sometimes. And this one, it's not a matter of neglect, it's a matter of poor planning. And it's really no one's fault. What happened was, the farmers that you see out in the field here all belong to Langwater Farm, and Langwater negotiated a lease to use the farmland here. As part of the lease, they were going to use this building and help fix it up, and they also help maintain the community garden, which is across the street over there. And by the way, we still have plots that are available over there for next year. Don't start growing plants now. So the deal was they'd help, we'd come up with some community preservation money, and we did. And the problem was, it's a historic property. The state required a structural engineering study, which used up all of our money, and we don't have enough money to make our contribution to help them fix this up. So everything is stalled. The old group, Friends of Wheaton Farm, is trying to get back together to at least kind of straighten the doors and do some painting. But as you can see, the building needs some serious help. The good news is the structural engineering report says that the structure of the building is still very, very good. Couple of features to point out here on this. You know, so many of us do our best to keep the birds out of the attic. In the barn here, the idea was to let them in because birds ate bugs. Birds still eat bugs. And this area here is one of the primary areas in Easton for chimney swifts. So they would like to stay in there. Swallows would also stay in those holes up above and help eat the bugs. Okay. So Daniel Wheaton lived to 1841. When he got to be an old man, he wrote a will, which was interesting because it describes the furniture in each of the rooms, which is rare. And it turns out that he gave one of the rooms to his son and his wife. And so that's excluded. So you see the furniture was here, 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 and then this front room on the right-hand side, we don't know what was there because the son had that. When Wheaton died, his son Daniel B. Wheaton, another Daniel Wheaton, took over and lived almost to the turn of the 20th century. So the farm was in Wheaton family name for over a century. And it was still one of the biggest farms in town. As Daniel B. Wheaton aged, he hired people to help out in running the farm, including people that were part of the Manning family. Okay, and we'll talk more about the Mannings when we move on to the cemetery. Does anybody have any questions about this building, the neighborhood?
How many rooms? You know?
Let's see. There's 1, 2, 3, 4. It's like 5 on the first floor, and then the upstairs is probably the same. It's about 10 rooms.
Chimneys?
Yeah. Chimneys, I don't know. There's one on the end, and there's one on this end. Very typical of Federal style houses. One of the things that distinguishes Federal from Georgian is that Georgian houses still needed the big fireplace, so they usually had a central chimney. By the time the Federal period came along, Franklin had invented the Franklin stove, and each one of the rooms had its own little stove. The back of the house has a great room, which was the kitchen. If you've ever been to Sturbridge, you know that the kitchen was also the processing area of the house. So it was really, really a big room. I'm sure stuff was stored there. And it's been a while since I've been in there. There may actually be a back chimney in that house. Yep.
Ed, any truth to the story that Roger Williams went down Bay Road as he was exiled from Massachusetts Bay and went to Rhode Island?
I believe that story is true. It really was the easiest way to get from Boston to Providence, Newport area. There were alternate routes. You have to be careful. Sometimes you'll hear about the old post road, and this was sort of a branch of the old post road, but it never was really the post road. The post road is the one that George Washington took, sadly, to miss Easton. In the time that Roger Williams was coming, which was the 1630s, this really was the only way to get from there to Rhode Island. So yeah, Roger Williams and Hutchinson probably as well. So a number of famous people did come down the road before us. Any other questions?
Did they add on to this house in the back?
They did not add on to the house. Yes, they did add on to the house, but they added on by putting a connected barn on the back.
They don't still hold the daycare, child thing?
No, the issue became the fun part of Wheaton Farmers across the street, and people became terrified of crossing the road. And so what they were hoping to do was build a sort of like a pavilion, a post barn, where the parking lot now is located. And when we put the parking lot in, because we had to fight the druggies, Wheaton Farm Conservation Area has over 1,000 acres of land. It's bigger than Borderland. It's all in Easton. The back parking lot, the original parking lot, was in back of here. And essentially that was there more or less for the convenience of the water department, because one of our wells is back there. And unfortunately, night visitors to Wheaton Farm would come in there and do really bad things. Okay. As a member of the Friends of Wheaton Farm, I remember doing a cleanup. We found needles. We found a pregnancy test. Thankfully, the girl wasn't pregnant. You know, it was horrible. We couldn't really get the police department to come in there because, you know, they have a route that they run, and going back there and coming out was kind of a hassle. They would come if the people at Wheaton Farm noticed some really unusual activity, but it became a very dangerous place at night. So to help that out and to also help the community garden, the new parking lot was put in, again using CPA funds. I probably should say I'm a member of the CPA committee, so I'm biased, but that was a good deal that the town did. We've done a lot of projects that wouldn't have gotten done without CPA funds. And so if you're now a walker at Wheaton Farm, you come up here. It's not a perfect solution. We know that there are people that have, you can't use the word handicapped anymore, but if you could, you know, folks in wheelchairs or who are missing a limb or whatever, and this parking lot is kind of inconvenient, and we haven't really figured out a way to make that fair for them. But other than that, this has worked out very well. So, more questions?
When is hunting season?
When is hunting season? That's a real good question, and the answer to that is it varies, but all the conservation land in Easton is huntable. So you do have to be careful in the woods in the winter, in the fall mostly. And I almost got shot once, which would have been really bad because the hunters were there illegally. It was a Sunday. You can't hunt on Sundays. And there they were, and I was stomping through the woods. And I would recommend, if you're there in hunting season, making a lot of noise, maybe whistling or something like that. Because it does get hunted. There's a lot of deer out there. There's a lot of coyote out there. It's 1,000 acres of contiguous land, many, many habitats. So it's really, really important for the biodiversity of the town. And it's a great place to go nature watching. There's, also, if you love butterflies, there's all sorts of butterflies out there, and you know, turkeys, wild birds of all kinds and varieties. So that's one thing we could do if we were on a 3-hour tour. I'd show you some, you know, animal hotspots, but no, not today. So now that we've had Frank move and do all that work, it's time for us to move on. We're going to go around the corner onto Prospect Street. Right before you get to the cemetery on the right, it looks like you can pull off. I don't recommend that. I tried it the other day and I almost got stuck. I had to back out. So what I do recommend is I'm going to pull all the way up to the front of the cemetery, pull in back of me. Don't park beyond the end of the cemetery. And we didn't quite expect this number of cars. So you can also park on the other side of the street where the other cemetery is. And just as long as you leave traffic there, we'll all be gone before the police get here.
Can we walk up there?
Yeah, you could, yeah.
Just carefully.
Well, I mean, yeah, you're going to walk down the road. You could walk down the edge of the field, I suppose.
If I was walking, I'd go through the property.
Okay, are we all into walking? It adds, you know, it's going to be more than an hour tour now. Going to do it? All right, we're going to walk. All right. If you don't want to walk, get your car. Okay. Everybody's here. Hallelujah. We all made it. One of the sad problems is once upon a time when I was young, 50 years ago, is when I started helping out recording some of our cemeteries, you could still read these stones. they weren't covered with this wonderful material, lichen, whatever you want to call it, which is an incredibly interesting plant-fungus combination, but it obscures these. The Cemetery Commission does not have a budget, a real substantial budget, so it's kind of tragic. The constituency never makes any complaints, so our cemeteries for a long time have been sadly neglected. The commission now has a very active member led by the chairman of the Historical Society. He's also chairman of the Cemetery Commission. That's Tim. Yes, Tim Hurley. Thank you. Sorry, Tim. But the person that I really want to say thank you to is a man named Ferris Bliss, who you may see if you go up to pay your taxes. He works at the town hall as a retiree, and he is also going around to individual cemeteries and updating the database of who's buried where. And that's, as you can see, easier said than done with some of these stones. This is a stone that somebody spent a fair amount of money on. Gravestones in Easton come in basically 3 varieties. Number 1, the oldest stones tend to be made out of slate, which is what this is. Newer stones tend to be made out of marble, and way in the corner where we'll eventually end up is a marble stone, and then the recent ones are granite. All of that has to do with the technology for cutting stones and the availability of things. Marble is cool. You know, all those great Italian sculptures are made out of marble, so hey, I want a gravestone made out of marble, but we didn't have any until folks got out to Vermont, and most of the marble for the gravestones of the 19th century come from Vermont. Granite gravestones only come in when it became easy to carve granite, which is our hardest stone. So for many years, people made do with slate. Now, some of the slate in our oldest cemetery, Church Street, which we'll eventually visit, was really hard and didn't have layers that easily separated. So those stones have lasted very well, but this stone here most likely came from Attleboro, which was the source of much of the stone that we used here in Easton. A good thing and a bad thing. Attleboro stones oftentimes came in other colors. So there's red slate, and there's green slate, and then there's the typical grayish slate like this. The bad point was, however, that the layers separate easily, and when rainwater gets on top of this, it works in and some of the stones flake off. So that's a problem. So now we're stuck with a cemetery that we can't necessarily identify all the people. We also have cemeteries where a lot of stones get broken. Chaffin, in his History of Easton back in the 1880s, oftentimes said that the wonderful youth of Easton were smashing the stones, which is probably true. But we have not, thankfully, had a lot of vandalism, but we simply had Mother Nature breaking stones. So when the Cemetery Commission does have money, what they've done is they've replaced some of the original stones with the names of the person that's buried here on a granite stone, okay? And I don't see a rhyme or reason to this other than that the stone was broken, okay? So, as you all know, flags are placed by the veterans. Most of the time this works pretty well. Hello, Mr. Dragonfly, or Miss Dragonfly. Are you a male? Oh, okay. But there are some gravestones that are placed on, like, wives of veterans and things like this, because they can't read the stones anymore, okay? And kids are much more likely to come in and move these around than they are to damage the stones. Dragonflies are very territorial, and they'll come back, and this is therefore a male. He's patrolling this area, and he's waiting for the girls to show up. So let's move down in this direction. So this is an interesting question, and I have no answer for it. As I pointed out when we were over there, this is the African American section of town. By the 1850s, there was about a dozen African Americans living in Easton, and 2 or 3 lived in Northeastern, and the rest lived in this area. In this cemetery, we have 3 African American families that are buried: the Johnsons, the Cordners, and the Mannings. Okay, I couldn't find the Mannings' grave the other day. They were the last family to move in, but the Cordners, who married into the Mannings, and the Johnsons were here early. And we're standing in where the Johnsons and Cordners were buried. You notice they're over here. Those folks are over there. I'm not sure that means anything, because people tended to be buried with their family, but it is interesting that they're here and they're not over there. This is a cemetery that has more spite to it than any other cemetery in town. We'll see that in a minute. But here we are. Edward Johnson was a person who was born in 1753. He was old enough to fight in the Revolutionary War. Whether he actually did or not, we haven't been able to find out. Edward Johnson is just too common a name. And there's a good possibility that he was originally known as Edward Black. So he may deserve a flag that he doesn't have. But his family's here, and the Cordners are here. We may be able to see, I'm hoping, I can no longer bend over long enough to read these stones because they're so difficult to see. But if you see the name Manning, please let me know. And more importantly, the last slave in Easton is supposedly buried here. That would be Kate Miller. Kate Dean was the last slave in Easton. The Johnsons were here, so this story gets confusing. Slavery in Massachusetts was ended by a court case, which basically said that a couple of different slaves who had sued for their freedom were actually free under our Constitution of 1781, which said all men are created equal. So they were freed, but it was in the papers, but nobody came to town and knocked on your door and said, you're free. So what happened in some towns in Massachusetts was nobody bothered to tell the slaves. And 1790 rolled around, and there was a question on that census. Damn census causes so much trouble. There was a question on the census, are there any free people of color living here or slaves? Well, slavery was illegal in Massachusetts. Everybody kind of knew that, even though they might not have mentioned it to everybody that it applied to. So you'll see all of a sudden that many slaves became free in 1790 instead of 1783. In 1790, the Dean family negotiated with Kate and basically said that when her master, James Dean, died, she'd be free forever. Okay, well, she actually was free, but hey, it's a legal document. Another 13 years passes, and finally in 1803, James Dean dies, and another document says, and he left you this, this, and this, small inheritance. So we don't know whether Kate, I always thought, what a nice guy, she liked him so much that she stayed with him all these years. If you really get into his history, he wasn't all that likable a guy, and so there may have been some hanky-panky going on. We don't know. Kate lived until 1809. She allegedly got married, although the marriage is not recorded here in Easton, and eventually died and is buried here someplace. The question is the stone still here? did she ever have a stone? Chaffin says she did. And for the longest time I was looking over there, which Chaffin treats these two cemeteries as the same cemetery. This is the old part, that's the new part. We're going to go over there in just a second, because I've got a couple of things to point out to you. I want to take you into the corner because, hey, there's more scandal.
Is there a reason why they're facing all this way?
It's amazing.
Instead of like,
Veterans Grave.
was the street this way? Or?
No, the street's
that
always
not
been this
there?
way.
Why does it face like this?
The preferred thing is to have your stone so it's on this way, facing that way. So you read it this way, but you're looking in this reason. And the reason you're looking for in that direction, looking east, is that on the day of resurrection, God is going to get busy early,
That's good.
and you want to be there to see the
That's
sunrise.
true? You just
Yeah.
make that up, or is that true?
No, that's true. That's true. And it also raises the issue of these slate stones. How do you tell the dates apart if you can't read them? And sometimes you can tell from the design on the top. And so first of all, the oldest ones have skulls because the old Puritan ministers wanted to scare the hell out of you. And, what's the great slogan? As I am now, so you will be. And they would always have the church next to the cemetery, so people could, get that lesson that you're damned. And then people in New England got wimpy, and so the deaths had changed to angels. Okay. Or in the case of the Soul family carvers from down in the Plimpton area, it changed to an abstract. And then a little bit later, because now, thank God, everybody's going to be saved, you'll see sunrises on the top of the stones, symbol of the resurrection. Okay. And then finally, hey, we're cool, we're America, we have democracy, and ancient Greece had democracy, and all those guys got buried in urns. So we're not going to be buried in urns because, damn, how do you do that? But they put urns on the top of these, and it becomes known as the willow and urn thing, even though the willow is, an oriental. Weeping willows come from the Orient, and the urns come from Greece. So you'll see all of those designs in some of the cemeteries that Ferris has gotten to and cleaned up, and we'll see some of those. But this over here is, believe it or not, marble, and it's from 1866, and it's the grave of Emma A. Griggs' mother. Basically the inscription, the poem, which you can see barely, says something like, bury me under the whispering pines, it will, so it's a maple tree, I know. Bury me under the whispering pines, it'll soothe my troubled soul. Emma apparently was a troubled soul. I did a lot of research on her, but she's interesting. The legendary story, which I heard from Kippy Grant, who lived his entire life in this area, is that the people in the neighborhood always believed that Emma was a mistress of one of the Ameses, and that she died a tragic, broken-hearted death. The actual cause of death was some kind of intestinal infection, which doesn't sound good. She was a mother of three, two different people who she was willing to share the last name with, but apparently didn't bother to go through the ceremony with. The chances are very good that her mother was a prostitute down in New Bedford, and her father was a sailor, which we have a last name but not a first name. So when she died, in 1866, Daniel B. Wheaton was the person in charge of administering the estate, and she's listed with the guy she was living with, Mr. Case, 2 children by him, 1 children by the unknown Mr. Griggs, and she had $250 worth of property. Okay, that's not very much. Mr. Manning an African-American painter who lived next door, we'll see his house in a minute, had, when he died shortly thereafter, over $1,000 in property. So she was very poor and very sad. So there's a haunting story here. I wish we knew more about her. Here's the inscription here. And then down below, you know, hey, if this doesn't get you, then it says here, peace, peace, peace. So God bless Emma. I wish she had had a happier life. When I first started teaching local history at Oliver Ames, I said, hey, Emma Griggs, one of the mistresses of the Ameses guys, let's do a little research. Who could it be? She was born in 1835, and we got to the point where, geez, you know, the guy they named the school after would be a perfect candidate for the bad guy here. So we stopped researching. Chances are there was one of the Ames boys, Horatio, who ended up getting divorced from his wife by going to New York City and frolicking with ladies of ill repute. So he's my number one candidate here. Okay. But he's of the previous generation. He would have been an older man. Emma.
Ed,
Yes, sir.
Can you guess how she would have got so substantial a stone?
I think people felt sorry for her.
It was a neighborhood
Yeah.
effort, something?
Yeah, and you know, hey, her estate was worth $250, and Daniel B. Wheaton was the executor, and he took $90 in execution. So he bought the stone, clearly. Maybe Daniel B. had something to do with her reputation. Who knows? Okay. Okay, we're going to go diagonally through the gravestones. As you go, look for Mannings's and Dean's. You'll see a Dean stone or two, but we're looking.
Dean right here.
Yeah, that's Mary. Unfortunately, we're looking for Kate.
All right,
And
everybody.
Kate Dean.
I think Kate went to live with the Johnson family the last years of her life.
Yes, she did. Yes, thank you for mentioning that. Yeah. So why isn't she over there in the sort of segregated part of the thing?
Yeah.
I want to find the Mannings. That was it.
They definitely need to be cleaned, huh?
Yeah, it's a tough job too.
Yeah. I took pictures years ago of a few guys in Easton scrubbing them for the Enterprise, but I don't know if they do it anymore.
There's a compound you put on it and you just leave it and the stuff falls off. We'll see that when we visit the oldest cemetery in town. Hey, we're going over here. You don't want to miss this one. Does everybody know the story here? So this is where Josiah, more or less, this is more or less where Josiah Keith III is buried. Our beloved highway department maintains our cemeteries. There was an attempt when Melanie DeWare, who lived around the corner, was chairman of the cemetery commission to have people adopt the cemetery, but that's kind of gone by the boards. So the town mows this, and there have been, believe it or not, it's certainly not true now. Our guys are really good now. But in the olden days, not necessarily the cream of the crop became members of our highway department, and they drank a little bit. In fact, they drank a lot. Okay? So the stones oftentimes would be taken up, leaned against a stone wall, and then the mowing would take place, and then the stones would be put back. If there was drinking involved in between, they didn't always get put back where they were supposed to be put back. And there's a cemetery on Bay Road where that happened. It didn't necessarily happen here, but this particular grave has moved a little bit over the years because it looks wrong. Hey, look, everybody's buried facing this way except this guy. Okay? And this is Josiah Keith III. As I said, up until the beginning of the 1800s, Bay Road was cool. You know, stagecoach went by and everything was great, and you could make a living being an innkeeper as long as you didn't fool around too much. Josiah Keith III had a inn, pretty much where the the Sunoco gas station is located today at Five Corners. And just like everybody else, he had a mileage marker in front of his house, and he was doing great, except for the fact that he really wasn't doing great because he wanted to put on a big show, spent a lot of money on dishes and pewter and things like this, bought land, was going to be a big guy, and unfortunately, in the early part of the 1800s, what ultimately became Turnpike Street and 138 came through as a turnpike, the brand new highway that everybody wanted to use. So business died on Bay Road, and Mr. Keith had a huge debt. The best way to say it is he owed everybody in town money. Okay, the list is huge. So eventually it got to be too much for him. Here's a guy that was supposed to be really important in town. He had been a captain in the Revolutionary War, a leader. So he didn't know what to do, and eventually he committed suicide. We had 2 Revolutionary War captains commit suicide, so you can see after the war, things were not all that great for these guys. He killed himself. Well, the tradition was if you killed yourself, you couldn't be buried in consecrated ground, which, hey, is kind of a Catholic thing, so, you know, maybe Josiah made it to the cemetery because they couldn't keep him out, but the folks in town were still a little PO'd that he died with all the debts. So they buried him over here at an angle to everybody else. Okay. And when his daughter moved up the street on Bay Road to right before Cross Street, they said, hey, why don't you take his stone with you? And by the way, we're going to erase his name off the stone. So if you see the stone in front of 345 Bay Road, you'll see that they erased out Josiah Keith, and it's a half a mile off from where it's supposed to be. And the reason is the daughter saved it, so somebody loved him. But he's buried here. Now, the problem here is that the DPW thought that this was a mistake, that one of the earlier DPW guys had moved the stones. And so back in the late 60s, early 70s, they moved the stone and put them so that it was facing the same way as everybody else. Now, at that time, a man named Duncan Oliver was a real important historical researcher in town, and he knew the story. So he snuck down here one night and was in the process of moving it back when the police department showed up and said, what the heck are you doing? Luckily, he was glib. He was a teacher and ultimately the principal of the high school, and he explained it to them and quoted the sacred name of Kippy Grant. Kippy Grant told me it has to be this way. So everything got put back the way that it was and has stayed that way ever since. But that's the story here. We're going to take a quick cross over the street. Anybody find any Manningses yet? So here we are over here, and there are some marble stones, and you can also see that some of the slate stones are actually in a little bit better stone condition than they were before. But right here, here's one that's splitting. If you had a little hammer, you could split the whole thing right off. And that's the way slate works. It's a sedimentary rock, and sedimentary rocks are layers of stuff. Slate is mud, basically. So this is the little bit newer thing. There's a few stones here that are actually made out of marble. Most people buried on this side of the street are Williamses. And this is the Williams neighborhood. So Benjamin and John Williams all had numerous descendants who stayed in the area because there was plenty of land. The reason I really brought you over here was not so much because of the stones, but because of this house right here. The one that has the star on it, that's 274 Prospect Street. And that house was built probably around 1845 by a man named Marshall Mannings. Marshall? Yeah, Marshall Mannings. And he had married one of the Cordner girls. He was African American, and they lived in that house all their lives, and then their children lived there as well. Couple of interesting things about that. One of the boys ended up marrying a woman who was also African American, who had been born in Tennessee. Well, nobody in Easton was born in Tennessee. So we think that she arrived in Easton because she was a fugitive slave, and that she ultimately settled into the community and got married. So that's pretty unusual. We also know that when one of the Cordner ladies passed away, her obituary was put into the Liberator, which was the abolitionist paper of the time, and that when Louisa, the daughter of the Manning family, passed away at age 22, her obituary was put in there as well. So why was there some connection to the Manning family, you know, and the Liberator? Well, we don't know. The town had a pretty good reputation for anti-slavery. The town was divided on the issue, but we had a person named Caleb Swan who was really in the forefront of fighting for the end of slavery. And the feeling is that despite the fact that the family was black and therefore didn't get newspaper coverage like the white guy did, they may have been involved, and that this particular house here, that one there, might have been a stop on the Underground Railroad. It's a perfect house for it because it's, you know, it's on the Bay Road, which leads to Boston, which is where most of the fugitive slaves were destined to go. And it's just enough off the road so that there's a little bit of safety and security there. After the war was over, the Manning family joined another thing that we don't know very much about, and that's sort of the fresh air movement. Many families in Easton took in kids that today we would have, you know, called foster children. Kids that were from the city but wanted to get some fresh air. So you see these in the censuses. There's all these young folks. They took in African American kids that had been raised, you know, came from other places. One of the kids got adopted into the family, and that adopted boy ended up having a decent career in the U.S. Navy, which was kind of cool. It was, the Navy, unlike the Army, was less segregated in the 19th and early part of the 20th century. So here are people that were at the forefront, we believe, of the fight for rights. And the Cordners and the Johnsons were there too. As Frank pointed out, I don't know if you all heard him, that Kate Miller, the last slave in Easton, lived her last few years at the Johnson household. So it was a tight-knit group here. I wish we knew more about them. There was a similar group and a larger group in Rainham of people, and in Randolph the same thing. African Americans tended to stay together because it turns out it didn't matter whether you were free or not. If you were free, you know, a descendant of a slave in Massachusetts that was free, you didn't have any papers. So that meant that you were in danger of any slave catcher coming by and say, you don't have any papers, you're such and such a slave, we're going to take you back, even though there was no back for them to go to. So it was not an easy way to live. Okay, any questions about our cemeteries here? We still haven't found Kate. Okay.
There's a Thomas Williams.
Yeah, there's a Tommy Williams. There's tons of Tommy Williamses.
Yeah. It looks
That's
like a newer stone.
Yeah, he died in 1841. The marble stones don't take up the lichen because they don't have the grit.
Yeah.
Okay. So what these do is they turn black with another kind of mold. And they're easier to clean. The problem with marble stones is that acid rain causes them to bubble up and rot away. So we're lucky now that in the 50 years that I've been visiting gravestones, acid rain has gone down a lot due to the Clean Air Act, which we still have that. Nobody's done anything with that today, have they? That has really cleaned up the air quality, which is nice. Okay, seeing no questions, it's now time to turn around and go home.
Okay.
Thank you. Thank you.
How long is this?
10:38.
Yeah.
8 minutes over, yes. Okay. And next week we're going to be at, where did he say?
Hayward Pool.
Hayward Pool. Oh, Hayward Pool's nice. Yeah, that's good.
Pine Grove Cemetery on the opposite side of Southeastern Regional next week.
It's on actually Moore Street.
Oh, I love it.
There's that little loop of a street. We're going to go to Pine Grove Cemetery first and then walk down the street. There will be walking involved in that, unlike today where this was a big surprise to me. Okay.